Good way of looking at it. A good way of looking at it.
Would you like to hear my proverb?
Oh, you have a proverb.
By all means, please.
I brought you a proverb because we're going to be talking about youth engagement.
Yes.
So in Ireland, we speak English because, like Kenya, we were colonized by the British, but we have our own language, Irish Gaelic. And in Irish, we say, Moll an oige agus chucky she.
Exactly.
Now,
You agree?
would you like to
agree.
interpret that one? Yeah. Moll an oige agus chucky she. An oige is the youth. Moll an oige agus chucky she literally means praise the youth and they will come forward. But I'd like to think that it means encourage or even engage the youth and they will come forward. And it seems to me that's an appropriate one to
Repeat
think
that
about.
all the
Merl and Oige.
Mull, which means to praise, mull.
Yes.
An oige is youth. Agus, chucky Agus means and, chucky They will come. Literally, she will come because youth is female in Irish. As it were. But anyway, yeah.
Merl and Oige.
Agus
Agus
chucky
chucky.
Yeah. So encourage
Encourage the
engage
youth,
and they will come
And
forward.
they will come forward. Very good one. City, what's your interpretation of this proverb?
Well, from where I sit,
Yes.
okay, it is this. The youth represent a new beginning. The youth represent continuity. And if you let the youth flourish, then you welcome continuity and the newness of life. That is how I look at it.
Very nice.
What do you say to that, Stephen?
I think that's exactly it.
He can go home.
He can go home now.
There's a story in today's Standard, and with a very beautiful photo there. You see the photo?
Yeah.
The centerpiece of the Standard? It says, Gen Z's plan with military precision. And this, the caption for this photo is, intern doctors, other medical practitioners, and Gen Z's protest outside the Ministry of Health headquarters in Nairobi during the Occupy MOH protests yesterday. The story is on page 7. I'm just going to read some excerpts from this story written by Fidelis Mogaka. He says, in the arena of Kenyan politics, a new force has emerged, reshaping the landscape without traditional leadership hierarchies. Despite that, Gen Z have appeared more organized than the country's political parties that are famous for disorder and fights from within. Generation Z, Kenya's youngest adults born after 1996 and younger millennials, have sparked a remarkable movement against the controversial Finance Bill 2024 and other governance in general, demonstrating unprecedented organizational prowess and digital savvy. What began as discontent on TikTok evolved into a nationwide revolt, showcasing the power of collective action driven by youthful determination and digital connectivity. The Gen Z has defied conventional wisdom by orchestrating a remarkably well-structured movement devoid of centralized leadership operating in physical offices. They're leveraging their digital fluency, and they've established a communal fund dubbed the Kitty, pooling resources to cover everything from medical bills for injured comrades to logistics for widespread protests.
Extraordinary.
Big thing that's happened here in the country. What the Gen Z have structured and the main wins here, they say, for example, there's a graphic presentation here. Number one, they have a communal fund, the Kitty, for medical bills and logistics, organized hospital visits and providing aid to injured comrades, blood donation drives for victims of protest-related violence, armies on TikTok and X to disseminate information, speed on hashtags like hashtag Occupy Parliament and hashtag Reject Finance Bill 2024 to unify voices, crowdfunding to cover transportation and other costs, cyber attacks on government websites to draw attention to their grievances, leaking personal information of political leaders for direct engagement, creating a digital wall of shame listing politicians supporting the finance bill, honoring fallen comrades through memorials, and attending funerals.
Extraordinary. Extraordinary.
Is it?
Yeah, and I really want to speak to some of the really positive dimensions of what that article, I think, has very correctly identified. The amazing nature of this, sometimes called leaderless, but actually some friends call it leaderful movement. Will you forgive me if I do one thing before I do that, before I turn to the positive things, and just express my sorrow for those who've lost their lives and their families. The Secretary General of the United Nations, as you know, he put out a statement very early on in this protest, extending his condolences, and I want to repeat that this morning. When we were talking in the run-up to this, Eric, I told you, I used to go on protests myself as a teenager in Ireland. Now I'm 57. I'm 3 times the age of the people on the streets. But I remember very well protesting against apartheid, protesting against violence in Central America, protesting, by the way, about the unequal tax burden in Ireland when I was a teen as well. So, this is not unfamiliar territory. But those who protest peacefully have a right to do that. That right is an international right, it's a universal right, and it's a Kenyan right under the Constitution, and nobody should lose their life in the course of a peaceful protest, and I feel that very, very strongly. So I wanted to start there. But then to go to what your colleagues on the Standard described there. Yeah, well, I just said, I'm 57. I'm 3 times the age of these protesters. And what they've been able to do in terms of how they organize is remarkable. And how you can take a movement that is so large and so engaged and so diffuse and so leaderless or leaderful, and yet articulate a set of demands that is clearly itemized, I think is incredible. And it's taught us, and I don't mind admitting to you, it's taught me an extraordinary lesson, because I wouldn't have bet on that. About a year ago, I was in Kibra, and it was World Youth Day, and I was speaking to a hall full of about 300 or 400 youth activists. And I said, I'm fed up of being that old white guy that repeats endlessly, we have to listen to Kenya's youth. We must listen to Kenya's youth. Did I mention that we have to listen to Kenya's youth? And you don't leave any time to listen to Kenya's youth. But then I said, here's my challenge, right? The last time I checked, there are 35 million of you. How do I listen, as a UN official, to 35 million of you without going deaf? I'm going to be just drowned in all of the diversity of opinion. This movement has proven me wrong. This movement has shown that you can engage at scale, you can organize at scale, and yet you can prove to the world that you can produce a very clear, consistent set of expectations and aspirations for the country and for the government. And that's really striking. And I think, what I would want to say is that's a moment of opportunity we mustn't lose for Kenya, but it's actually a moment of opportunity we mustn't lose for the world.
Yeah, it's interesting as you say that, because I remember a couple of months ago us having a conversation in this room, and we said, you know what, the lines for democracy or the lines for good governance seem to have been drawn by a particular set of people, and then that seems to be imposed on other nations. And I said, you know what, perhaps it is time that nations and their own decided to draw out the lines for what their democracy should actually look like. Or maybe it's something else. And so now you have Kenya doing a thing that has never been done anywhere in the world. There is no historical event or process that has taken place like what's happening in Kenya today. And so now, as we see that, do we then also accept or then begin to imagine that a new line or new boundaries of governance then away from what was previously drawn out then can actually happen?
That's the opportunity. That's absolutely the opportunity to reinvent how governance is done. But I'd put 2 tweaks on it. One, it's almost unprecedented. There are a few interesting examples that are a little bit incomplete. They're not really countries. They're like cities here or counties there that have experimented with this a bit. It's about 7 years ago now that the Oxford English Dictionary, its word of the year was youthquake. Because youth were beginning to do this around the world at scale. It's not that youth have never protested, of course they have. I did. But in these kinds of numbers, right, that's unprecedented. There are a few places that we can look to for some learning, but what Kenya is doing at the level of the nation, I think, I can't think of a parallel. So that's the first tweak I'd give it. But the second one is to say, it's Kenya, but not just for Kenya. Kenya can invent a model now for the rest of the world. Because you're right. I mean, it's my part of the world that for centuries dictated the terms of what governance should look like. It's high time Kenya and countries like Kenya gave lessons to the world on how to do it. Because this is not a challenge unique to Kenya. All around the world, countries and governments are wrestling with how to listen to and engage with youth and how to reinvent governance for the 21st century. That's everywhere. So Kenya could lead that.
If we say that governments around the world are struggling with how or what to do and how to manage the youthful population, even those who have a declining population, are we then saying that governments around the world are set in their ways and that the majority of people in governments around the world are traditional, they're much older people, but more importantly that they've forgotten what it was like to be youthful?
To be young, absolutely. It seems like a long time ago to me. I don't know if we're around the same age, Charles, but...
I am distinctly older than you.
Distinctly older. Well, you wear it well. You wear it well. But yeah, I think we forget.
Yes.
I think we do forget. But you can kind of reach back, right, and remember what that impatience was like.
I think that's what this particular movement is doing.
Reminding us.
Yes, clearly, loudly, because part of why it is the way it is because parents are supporting it. They may not have agreed. You see, one forgets that these young people live in societies, in communities, and in homes and in families.
Yeah.
And because they are young and they have been, they watch more than they talk. And so they learn more than you realize.
Right.
If the parents struggle, they know. If they have difficulties at home, they understand. They may not talk about it, but they understand. Now, because of the population that we have and the numbers that we have in our family setup, they are likely to have siblings, and if they don't, they're likely to have friends of the same age with whom they can compare notes. This is a manifestation of something in my mind that has been brewing for a long time.
Long time.
This generation, people say, are the generation who burnt schools. We had a period of time in this country where schools were being burnt. They were sending us a message then, we didn't listen.
Well, you used a verb earlier. I'm just going to pick you up on that. You talked about governments managing youth. If governments try to manage youth, they're going to fail, right? What they have to work out how to do is how you engage with youth, and that's a different challenge. Now, and I think that's a challenge, as I say, that everybody is facing. But look at the problems that we have in the world. Problem of climate change, problem of conflict, the problem of disease and pandemics like COVID. It's interesting, by the way, they all begin with C, don't they? Conflict, climate, COVID, capital, the cost of borrowing. Those are the four big problems that everybody is facing around the world, the cost of living. 5. Youth are the ones who are going to provide the solutions to that. My generation hasn't managed to.
Yep.
Your generation has contributed. Our generation has contributed.
Yeah.
I say contributed because as you're speaking, I was thinking, what is it that makes older people stoic? What is it that makes them traditional?
Charles is going to be speaking up for the elderly here.
Yes, I am. And elderly includes those who have one foot in the grave. Yes, I do. The experience that the older people like myself have had, transcending our youth to now, old age, the thing that we look at is we have been through these things.
Yes.
You see, now, that is the mantra. And so, traditionally, because we have, you ought to listen. But then you see, therein lies the problem. This is the information age. Age, yes, has experience, but knowledge is far more available, far more easy to acquire, and far more easy to disperse than any time in the history of mankind.
That's the difference this time, isn't it? And again, the Gen Zs have mastered using these online tools to organize, right, and to produce this articulated set of demands. So that's why I think this is a moment of opportunity that we haven't had before, where it actually becomes possible to engage large numbers of young people at scale, or large numbers of old people, right? So this is also part of the point. We can't leave this to be just a conversation for the youth and just the youth that are online. So we have to remember how many youth around Kenya don't have smartphones, aren't able to afford to be online in the way that, if you're going to be on TikTok right. So how do we engage them? But also other parts of society, and the elderly being one. In my part of the world, you're right. I mean, the population increase is declining, right? So then it becomes about the elderly as well.
You grew up in a time when the telephone, a public telephone, was a booth where people could walk
indeed.
to. Well, yes. But you see,
I courted my wife by fax machine. Nobody knows what that is anymore.
I thought you said you courted your wife.
Quartered, no. Hung, drawn and quartered, I hope not, no.
But imagine how public that was. Sending a fax to your girlfriend. Hey, baby. Can we have dinner on Friday at 6?
But there are all these people. You see, the sense of community mitigates against this idea that not everyone has a phone. You don't need to have a phone. One person, a group of 10, has a smartphone. You all have a smartphone.
Yep.
Yes.
I think this is also very interesting because the level of education that we're also seeing that's taking place with a movement like this is phenomenal. That there are people who have said that they're going to take their time to break down some of these things for people's understanding. And I think it's being filtered down for folks to actually understand. We saw the finance bill being put into different languages just 3 weeks ago.
Extraordinary.
And we saw people breaking it down into language that is used today. Call it colloquial, call it whatever you want to call it, but it was broken down for people to understand. It's the ABCs of the finance bill, and we saw that happening, for example. There's also an education of external factors that play in internal politics and governance that usually leaders of nations hide. Whether it's international organizations who play into a government's internal politics, and those now are being brought out to the fore. And I think it comes to a time whereby also the pull on an educated young people, it's not people who are ignorant.
No.
On an educated youth who are saying, you know what, we are very aware of what's happening and we're not going to allow business as usual. And there has also been the question of, is it protests then that we're going to allow this renaissance that we've seen today? Would there be another way? I personally think that it's one of the best ways. But would there be another way for bringing in of
I think there's a complementary way, so protest always has to be there. Always has to be an option, anywhere in the world. And the Constitution recognizes that, right? And you've got an amazing Constitution here in Katiba. You have all of the tools. Right? We just need to live it. But I think that there is another way, or a complementary way. So I'm not ruling out protest, but that becomes the next option, right? But what you want, if you're really going to reinvent governance, what you're going to do is invent a mechanism for permanent, ongoing, routine engagement with large sectors of the population, youth certainly, but other sectors too. And what could that look like? Well, the online, I think, is a real opportunity for that. I don't necessarily think, with all the respect I have for what's been done on X and TikTok, those are great spaces for energy, amplification, getting everybody riled up, getting everybody mobilized. But there are actually other online tools, and these have been used in that small number of examples I started to allude to. Cities that have looked at participatory budget making, for example. The Kenyan Constitution, by the way, says that's how you should do budget making here too. There should be public participation. It's in the Constitution. So how do you make that real? There are online tools that are better than X or TikTok for having a debate that we call deliberative, where you have, tens or hundreds of thousands of people engaging, and then you move towards a consensus, right? So I could imagine a kind of an ongoing mode of governance in Kenya. And I would love to see Kenya model this, where Well, let me give you the analog version. The analog version is called Switzerland, right? Everybody knows that in Switzerland, almost everything, like the size of the height that the hedges are in your garden.
Public participation.
It's public participation. It goes all the way down to the village level, right? Imagine a 21st century version of that in a country the size of Kenya, right? 60 million people engaging online at the level of the village.
On the mundane matters.
On the mundane matters of the day, right? And arriving deliberatively at consensus. I think Kenya could do it. I think you've got an educated population.
Yep.
I think you've got that. My God, you've got an engaged population. I've never seen a population like Kenya for engagement. You've got this
tech-savvy population.
A tech-savvy population. You've got the internet penetration. You've got a constitution that says you should do it.
Yep.
Why not just do it and teach the world how that can be done?
We are hosting Dr. Stephen Jackson. He is the United Nations Resident Coordinator in Kenya. Before we take the break, Stephen, this is where you tell us, who is the UN Resident Coordinator? What's your job?
He's an Irishman struggling to do his best for Kenya. But it's my job to bring together the energies and the expertise of 25 different United Nations agencies, that alphabet soup of everything from the Food and Agriculture Organization all the way to the World Health Organization, all working for Kenya.
So what does that mean?
We try to bring our expertise together so that it isn't just, the agriculturalists working on agriculture and the health people working on health and the tech people working on tech, but we try and bring it together in a way that actually supports the government and people to move ahead.
So you sit at the head of the table for all those UN agencies.
The first amongst equals.
At the head of the table.
Yes.
Okay.
You're going to get me in big trouble with my colleagues now.
City.
Actually, you say it has changed. It has changed. The one thing it has changed and which is irrevocable in this country, it has brought in accountability. Something that we haven't had for decades. Members of parliament, politicians, budding and otherwise, those who are currently in seats know they are being watched and they're now going to be held accountable. But let me now have a little accountability question for the UN.
Sure.
I am delighted, happy that we are receiving assistance, and I'm happy that the UN acknowledges that they can learn something from this country. But why would the UN take the time, bother, and money to want to help Kenya?
Well, first, because it's our job. That's what we're asked to do. We're asked to work here to support Kenya's people, Kenya's government, to serve its people. So that's the first point. It's my job. But the second is because I devoutly believe in it. That point about accountability, Charles, that's the fundamental of democracy, right? Accountability anywhere in the world, right? So it would be in our interests to help you, Kenya, to try and perfect that. I think you're right that this protest movement is the beginning of that. But this isn't a finished thing. No democracy is ever a finished thing, by the way. And it would be a matter of immense pride, I think, for us as the United Nations to help with that if we can, and if Kenya wants that help. But then there's a third reason, and that's Eric alluded to in his little spiel just as we came back from the break there, which is how Kenya can furnish an example for the world. And the UN is also about that, because we're about trying to promote the sharing of best practice, right? We already talked, and you said this is sort of unprecedented, right? This is a problem that everybody's facing, a challenge that everybody's facing. How do we renew democracy? Because democracy is in trouble in many parts of the world, certainly on my continent. How do you renew it? This would be a way. This would be a way you'd do it. And so then that would be another reason why the UN would want to help, because we would want to be part of helping consolidate a success that the world can learn from. And I'll just say one final thing about that. I know it probably sounds a little bit abstract. It sounds like, the UN always does that, right? But the Secretary General of the United Nations is calling a summit in New York in September, and it's called the Summit of the Future. So the clue is in the title, right? It's a summit about what happens next. And it's really looking at all of these global challenges that we have. And one of them that he keeps talking about, Antonio Guterres, he keeps saying the social contract is broken. So he means the contract, the agreement, the effective deal between governments and the peoples they're supposed to serve. That contract is broken around the world. So if we could be part of, in Kenya, showing how you renew, you make that social contract new again, my God, that would be a proud moment.
What would it look like in terms of how a body like the United Nations would come into this without usurping the power that rests in a movement like this? Because we can already see in my home, Nigeria, protests and demonstrations against the government have already been slated for later next month.
That's right.
And this is as a direct result of what has happened in Kenya. To say that the power of the potency of something like this will then not be taken by a body like the United Nations, for example, without providing just support, but by saying, well, how about we take this over for you and say, how do you avoid such? In my mind, it's a danger.
It is a danger. It's a risk.
Yeah.
And we have to avoid doing that. We cannot come in, as we would say in Ireland, with our 10-league boots on and stomp all over this thing. It's one of the reasons I came on the show, if I can be honest with you, because I wanted to learn from you, learn from your listeners, how we could avoid doing that. We have to offer support where it's wanted, not where it isn't. But I think what we can do, Eric, you alluded to this, we can look at the small but growing number of examples of how this is being done in other places around the world. There are parts of Latin America that have used online fora for doing what we call prior consultation around a big, let's say it's a big infrastructure project or a big extractives, a big mine or something like that that's going to be very controversial, right? You use online tools to engage the population to try and find out, the parameters of what's possible and what's desirable. My own country, Ireland, has had really interesting experience with what we call citizens fora. Forums of citizens that engage around a public policy question about a piece of reform or whatever, and they're chaired independently. They collect the views of the populace, they kind of sift them and simmer them and then present them to government, and government takes them or doesn't take them. In Asia, there's been really different places, some cities, some larger polities that have experimented with using online tools to do things like budget making, to look at tax policy, to look at even government agendas. I think with all due deference to the movement says very loudly right now, we're not interested in dialogue.
Yeah.
We've told you what we think.
We want action.
We've told you what we expect. We want action. That's a very legitimate thing right now. 6 months, a year from now, there'll be new issues, right? Because society moves on. Back to your question, Du. Does that mean people have to take to the streets every time? If they need to. But hopefully, we could actually come up with a mechanism, a new way of doing governance.
So going to the streets, essentially, what we're saying is a catalyst, or it's a trigger towards other things that can happen later in terms of dialogue, or in terms of
participation, a national conversation.
Is there anywhere where we can say that this has happened? Where it started with the galvanization and mobilization for a protest over an issue. That issue was addressed, and then that movement continued. And it brought about greater accountability, greater participation, greater awareness in the selection of government. And then governments that were initially very rigid now becoming more engaging with the protesters.
Yes.
Examples like that?
There are examples like that.
For example.
There are a small number of them at this point. You look around the world, France went through, do you remember the gilets jaunes, the guys wearing the yellow jackets? Right. So there was actually a real soul searching after that, and then experiments with ways of engaging people. Switzerland, as I've said, but it's not exclusively Western Europe, as I've mentioned. I mean, particularly in Asia, where the internet literacy is so high, like it is here in Kenya. I think there's some very good examples there. It tends to be, so far though, at the level of cities.
Yep.
Cities have done this very well.
When you mention Asia, for example, I think of Thailand. Thailand, we saw those movements, the organizations, people pouring into the streets, trying to change the political order, but they were removing one family from power and installing another family in power. In Sri Lanka, we've seen recently, you've seen what happened in Sri Lanka. People have done this. Taiwan, a city, as you mentioned, where there was a movement like this, and they were raising issues, but then thereafter, it just seems to get back into
the old business as usual.
Yes.
Yeah.
How can we all work together to seeing that this movement goes beyond this, because what we are seeing now, just to give an example, is what we are seeing now is a government that is reluctantly responding. And it's not interested in really responding. So you'll try and brand this thing and say, these are people who've been, there's somebody who's behind them. They're not leaderless.
Some foreign power.
They've got a leader. There are other interests that are at play here. And then by and by, okay, so yeah, we are listening to you, but you guys are not getting it. You just don't understand the implication, for example, of not having 365 billion shillings extra to spend in the next year, and what that would mean. It's responding, but it's slow. So the fear is, once, say, you wanted me to reshuffle the cabinet, I've done that. You wanted me to sign the IBC bill, I'm signing it. What are you asking for? Now, the next things, are systemic, and they have to happen over time. They can't happen immediately.
Correct.
And then people retract into just things, and status quo remains. Status quo is the enemy here.
Yeah.
And government is status quo. A bureaucracy like the United Nations is status quo.
Yes.
But Eric, consider, you're absolutely right. Because people want to go back to the calm and quiet. They don't want people walking on the street protesting, hindering them from going where they want to go.
We're asking too many questions.
Yes, and also there's the fear that it might turn nasty, and who knows, their windscreen may be smashed. Why? Because that is what we've been accustomed to. Unfortunately, change doesn't come in that sort of clothing. Unfortunately, it very rarely does. The mistake the Gen Zs would make is to cede power. It would be a colossal mistake. Because that constant reminder of what they are doing or what they stand for is fighting against a tide that has been there for the longest possible time, and with every presidential election has been entrenched. And that's why we have what we call a political class. Okay? They also are not willing to cede power. So it's in their own self-interest. When they realize that their interest is threatened, then they'll be more inclined towards ceding and giving the appearance that they're changing. But in response to what we see the president doing, there's no clearer sign that he has missed the point completely. Because tokenism is not what is called for now. It's an insult if that is what you are doing. Because the opportunity to actually be the person who's brought about change will be missed. Now, we've seen missed opportunities in this country. And I think the Gen Z know this. Why I'm saying they know this, they have their own agenda. They are not allowing someone to set this agenda for them. Now, we'll complain and say, oh no, now they're going to be on thicker road, there could be a problem. Actually, yes, there'll be an inconvenience. That is certain. There may even be a few of them, a few rogue elements. They will be there. As I say, dogs come with fleas. Okay? But the point that you make that I want to emphasize on is this. This opportunity that has presented itself, are we trusting the Gen Zs to be able to walk with it and for us to follow? Because I hear the idea of working with them, understanding that I also get. As an older person, I get. But the question I'm asking is, are we willing to follow them?
Are we willing to cede?
Yes. Are we also
Position
willing
at
to
the front
cede
of
and
the
say,
queue?
okay, guys, tell us what to do?
Are they willing to take up that challenge?
That is an even better
in the
question.
longer term? Because you see, if you have this conversation now, yes, the conversation is being led and spearheaded by this younger generation.
Yes.
And this is what they're saying. Are they willing to actually continue and provide leadership beyond this, and getting into even providing and shaping government of the future?
Yes.
And shaping what our country then looks like into the future?
Yes.
Without responding or reacting to somebody else.
You're both identifying a challenge that is as new as today. Today's Tuesday, right? It's a protest day, and as old as time, right? Institutions are very slow to adapt. And the question that I have is, does this movement insist that it stays outside institutions, or can it eventually agree to breathe new life into institutions? That's going to be the challenge. The Gen Z won't be Gen Z forever. One day, they'll be as old as we are, right?
Yeah.
And there'll be a new generation with its demands. So how do we use this moment? How do we work together to make this moment a moment of actually profound change in how governance happens in Kenya, and therefore providing this model for the world? And I certainly don't, and the United Nations, I want to make that totally clear. First of all, we've no interest in being invited to a party where we're not welcome, right? So if Kenya doesn't need our help with this, that's fine. I'd love to offer our help, and I also don't think our help would ever be about trying to set the agenda.
To whom are you offering the help?
Yeah, I was going to say.
Kenya, if I can be as pious and as broad as that.
So who are you engaging?
With which instruments, essentially?
You
would
engage with government.
Yeah, government, which would be interesting because...
So we do, of course, work with and alongside government. That's part of our job. And so part of my job, if there is an interest in this, would be to say to Gen Z, to say to broad Kenyan society, but certainly to say to government, look, there are some examples of how, and there are tools out there that can be used to take a conversation that has been spontaneous, energetic, engaged, and sustain it. Help it sustain and help it progress. There are platforms that are better suited, actually, than X and TikTok, that are a bit more deliberative, that will allow you to make this, and the word routine sounds like a criticism, right? We say it's routine, it's boring. But you want to make this routine. You don't want to have to make it be, every time there's a crisis. You want this to become part of the muscle of how Kenya acts.
There's always the question of helping and understanding what is needed, and that only comes from asking. And then there's always the issue of modeling to suit your interests, because the UN has their interests. Now, how do you marry the UN interest with ours?
We have to be attuned to what the aspirations of the Gen Z are. And we have the advantage that has been made very clear for now. So these are the aspirations right now, right? So we have to listen to those. And it's back to your question. How do we avoid, we in the UN, we cannot come in, we would not want to come in. It wouldn't work. Who cares what we want? It wouldn't work. We'd be rejected out of hand if we tried to impose. And that would be right. It would be right to reject it, right? So I as is probably clear, I don't have a clear answer for you right now. We're right at the beginning of this. We're kind of old school in the UN. We've talked about listening to youth for a long time, but we haven't managed to do it.
Did you say kind of?
All right. Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. Touche.
I mean, just looking over time, I just reading history and history of governments, and then looking at, many would say that even governments that operated 20 years ago are in history, right? But is it possible, whether it's a renaissance of ideas, is it possible to have a new movement or new ideas void of the instruments of government, for example? Is it possible without structure? We have a wave that has come. I mean, I look at all the ages that have come and gone. But through those ages and through new ideas that were then being introduced and captured, all of these were on the bedrock of some kind of structure.
Goodness, that's a deep question. I feel like I'm in, a philosophy graduate school now. But I don't mean to make fun. It's an important question. I don't think so. I think in the end, no community can live with permanent crisis. And, we don't know what's coming the next day, and we don't know what's coming the next day. If you want to walk forward, You have to have some kind of a plan. But I do think, and this is the crucial point, that this movement is teaching us a new way to plan. Right? That's what's key for me. So the movement does, it seems to me, point the way to a new form of structure. Right? It's looser. It's louder. It's more energetic.
Yep.
That's great.
Yep.
That's great. And I think that's really what I want to say is I find that exciting. I don't know, sitting here on a Tuesday morning, how you do that, but I think Kenya already has some ideas.
It's already that moment.
That's right.
Many people may not realize this, but the UN is supported by governments.
Of course.
And government means taxpayers' money,
Correct.
right? So we basically run the UN. So speak to the people of Kenya on one hand, in about 30 seconds, and then spend another 30 seconds speak to the government of Kenya. What message would you pass?
People of Kenya, help us reinvent the United Nations so we can help you do what you've made clear you want to do. Right? So help us work out the answer to Ndu's question. And to governments, and the Secretary General has been very, very clear about this. He says, you need to realize that you need to reinvent the social contract with your peoples or your history. That's what he's said to governments around the world, and that's what this Summit of the Future is about. Reinvent, re-energize the social contract or your history.
Do they get what he means? Do you think governments are actually getting what Antonio Guterres is saying?
I think they're starting to. We'll see in September. Like one pillar, if I've got time to say it, one pillar of the Summit of the Future is to agree a set of global principles on how youth participate in governance.
Thank you.
That's what these protests are about.
Thank you for coming today.
Thank you so much for having me. What a great conversation.
We'll have you again soon. Dr. Stephen Jackson is the United Nations resident coordinator in Kenya. He's been our guest. We'll be looking at the Gen Z movement, how this is shaping Kenya's future, how this conversation can be sustained beyond the current immediate demands of the government, and also now taking them to demands for the people, and how that can help shape the future of the world.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.